The important thing to realize in a project of this scale and this complexity is it's not so different than building a building, or maybe some of you have built a house. It's a partnership and more than that, a collaboration. You can't build these kinds of things or install these kinds of works without that close sort of really vital partnership. So I want to thank a few people. First, Jim Clark of LexArts, who's really been a champion of this project from the very beginning. Nathan Zamaron, who also of LexArts, who was the project manager and took care of a lot of the details. And of course, Jim's staff down at LexArts, who were unfailingly prompt and supportive throughout the project. Also from Leadership Lexington, particularly Van Meter Pettit, who I got to know best in this project. Mayor Jim Gray. Special thanks to Jim Wilhite and Wilhite Limited and his crew. We put that piece of sculpture up there on the hottest day, I think, ever in Lexington, or certainly in the midst of the 3 hottest days ever recorded in Lexington. It was 105. We worked from 6:30 in the morning till 8:30 at night, and they were terrific. So here we have Concordia. And I want to just tell a short story, really, about how I came to work this way, and what I think are in the results of this is my first permanent commission of this body of work that's been ongoing for about 12 years. Next, please. Early in my career, I made sculpture that looked like natural objects. This one, I think, looks a bit like a seed pod or some other kind of natural references. It's welded steel. This is in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. You know, I was really interested in the kind of geometry, you know, shellfish, the Fibonacci series, all these kinds of wonderful patterns and shapes that recur at different scales and at different places in nature. Next, please. And in this process, I developed a process of composite structures. So for those of you who know, these are reinforcing rods that you use when doing concrete construction. They're all put together, lots and lots of pieces. And then, as you saw in the first image, they were welded smooth on one side. So you could see a kind of inside, outside. But this way of working, that is building up larger objects from many small ones, is I think something that runs consistently through the work even here. Next. I found that I could also build drawings in much the same way. This is ink on paper. It's a little fuzzy in this image, but these are long ink strokes from the center of this image. In my work, the drawing, sometimes I draw first and sculpt later. Sometimes we draw first and, sculpt first and draw later. So there's a kind of back and forth, but again, this kind of way of thinking about how marks or elements can build up a whole. Next, please. And then you can see also that there's these kinds of consistent formal things. So following that drawing that was made in 1989, this is a sculpture here in which these rebar and individual elements are not welded closed. They're now sort of transparent, more like the drawing itself that I just showed. Next, please. And then finally, in 1994, I was awarded a foundation from the Japan, fellowship from the Japan Foundation to study stone carving on an island called Shikoku, just south of Osaka in the Inland Sea. And while I was working in granite, I became really interested in the idea of that with stone, the surface of a material, surface of a sculpture, is actually a boundary between one material and another. That is, it's not fabricated. Right? The sculptures I've showed you before had thickness. You can always sort of imagine it as your fingers together, sort of enclosing a kind of compound curve. But whenever that surface had to be constructed, it always had some kind of thickness. But with the stone, the surface was more like an air bubble in water. That is, on one side of the surface was stone, on the other side was air or space. And this got me to thinking, how thin a surface could I fabricate? Right? How could I? What method could I use to make the thinnest surface possible? That is, something constructed that had the same kind of sensation or feeling as this object here. This is granite. It's about, you can sort of get your arms around it just to give you a sense of scale. But again, these natural forms sort of sometimes referred to this as a kind of knuckle, right? Maybe maybe something from the end of a chicken bone, right? I've always been interested in those kinds of forms, much like Henry Moore, if any of you know his sculpture. Next, please. So I thought, how can I make a thin surface? Well, I decided to, again, use lots of small pieces to build up a contiguous surface. What you're looking at here is metal strapping, the kind you see, when you get your refrigerator delivered or something. That blue steel that's wrapped around holds things to the pallets. It's quite strong, very springy. It's a tempered material, and I figured out a way to weave it. Basically, made a form, put it together, and then kind of cut it off of this master blank. In this sculpture, there are no physical connections. There are no rivets or seams anywhere. This surface is contiguous. It was in the form of a cylinder. And once I sort of figured this out, next image, please. This is the kind of result, the sort of the image I had in my head of how this process and this structure would work. But I began to notice that every time I touched it, it changed shape a little bit, right? It was really, really flexible. In fact, we used to move it around with a pole, and it would kind of hang down. It looked a bit like an animal carcass or something as we marched it around. But even though I was seeing these things, I wasn't so focused on its sort of dynamic properties. I was really focused on, this process of making this very thin surface. I satisfied that, and I thought, great, right? Well, then a summer passed. The piece was in storage, and I came back in the fall, and I laid the sculpture down. That's how I used to take this big barrel out of the center of it. It's about 7 feet tall and roughly 50 inches in diameter. And I pulled this barrel out of the center. Next image. And this is what happened. And I was sort of just kind of incredulous. That's one of those cheesy eureka moments, right? Wow, look at that. Well, what was interesting is that, so you had this one structure that could have more than one form. So in the past, where I'd been interested in quoting nature or using the geometry and shapes of nature as inspiration as kind of to find form for the pieces, I'd sort of, not necessarily deliberately, but I'd stumbled on a structure that had behavior, right? So it had a different idea of nature. That is, something dynamic and plastic and changing, something that responds to its context, change in position. Much like a rose bush, right? You plant a rose bush in the sun, and it takes one kind of form. It might grow very well. You plant it in the shade, it doesn't grow quite so much. You don't get so many blooms, but the information, the structure is still a rose bush. Its genetic material doesn't change, but its manifestation, depending on where it's planted, how it's planted, fertilized or not fertilized, watered, not watered, you get a different form. And I determined finally that the bulge, right, that you see in the center of this piece, was because that over time, that cylinder had settled and it had gotten bigger around the circumference, right, like a barrel. So when it was laid on its side, that created tension across the middle, and the two ends flopped down. Well, I kind of made this almost immediate decision that I could no longer make the work I showed you just a few minutes ago. This is now 1996. And I was really committed to finding ways of trying to put together material in these systems that could have interesting behavior. Not necessarily behavior I could predict, but behavior I could explore. Maybe more in a kind of empirical way, almost in a, you might think of sort of in a scientific way. Next image, please. So the next iteration of this project, which brings us to this Corten weathering steel alloy that was mentioned before, is a piece. This was at the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston, Texas. It's 44 feet long. It's a cylinder that's originally 11 feet in diameter, but is made of very, very thin material, half or a third of the width of material that's up on the roof here. So this, and I decided I wanted to sort of approximate that form of the woven piece, but in this steel. And I thought I had this bright idea that I would use these columns in the middle of the space to hold the center section up. Well, to make a sort of long story short, as we were finally removing the staging that we had used on the inside to put the piece together, kind of like 1, 2, and it ripped open. I mean, it exploded right through this center section here. Monica was there. About half a dozen people were there who were helping me do the installation. And I mean, it was just dead silent, right? Everybody's just, shocked. And my first concern was it was just going to continue to disintegrate, right? The opening was in 24 hours. What was I going to do? And I asked everybody to go home. And this young man who was working with me, my assistant, asked him to stay. And it sort of, over a couple hour period, it sort of dawned on me that if I was going to make work that had behavior and the sort of dynamic qualities, then I was going to have to sort of live with the consequences, right? That is, this sculpture built in this way with these kind of fasteners, positioned in just this precise way, the supports pulled out just like that. This was the only thing that could happen, right? The only way to change it would have been to sort of start over, right? Take it all apart, rebuild it, change its position, et cetera, to try to, if you wanted to prevent this outcome. So that it was important for me in the terms of this idea that not only in the system itself, but in relation to its context, that these pieces, these structures could continue to surprise me. Next, please. This is the same object, same structure, now installed in a different place, the old Sculpture Center up on 69th Street in New York City. In this installation, people actually had to walk down the center of the valley there of the piece. But here, when it didn't have those kinds of, that severe sort of pressure on it from the inside, it took a softer kind of form. But even here, you can see as it sort of nuzzles up against the wall, this side becomes asymmetric and the piece begins to sort of change and interact with its environment. Next. The next iteration, I was asked to do a piece for Socrates Sculpture Park. This is in Long Island City. This was a large piece in which there was no structure, that it was nothing to shape the work, right? A big kind of flat field. And so the form and the sort of wavy quality you see here was that within the structure itself, I changed the thickness and arrangement of the elements so that some parts were softer, less stiff, and some parts were more rigid. And then you can see here as it became a site for all kinds of sort of interesting interactions. The piece up here on the roof has a certain kind of, we have some distance from it, but Jim was talking about public art before, and oftentimes, no matter what you intend for your work, it gets used in the way that people learn to use it, right? I love this shot of this kid doing his little kickoff on the edge there. Next, please. So, had more to these stories, maybe over snacks later. Building these big cylinders all in one piece was really hard. It took forever. We had tons of problems. I mean, it was just really, really difficult. I was asked by a gallery, Black and White Gallery in Brooklyn, to build a space. It was a new gallery. This wonderful 25 by 50 foot courtyard, which you run through the gallery and you come out and it's open to the sky. And I was like, if I build another big cylinder, and how am I going to get it all in there and support it? And And I had one of these ideas that, I'd probably, want to ask my students why it took them so long to figure this out. I said, oh, if I break up the space into smaller pieces, it'll be more manageable, right? If I have a problem that has smaller components, it'll be easier to deal with. So we went from these big monolithic single units to these three. Again, looking for ways to introduce different kinds of behavior. I think you can see very clearly that this piece on the left is very, very plastic. The piece in the center is out of much thicker materials, much more rigid. And the one over on the right is somewhere in between. And in fact, this piece here is recycled bits of the last installation you just saw, right? So also, not only do the ideas get changed and kind of recirculated, but the work, the elements, the material itself. So we have 3. Next, please. And I thought, wow, if you have such interesting behavior with 3, what if you had 21, right? And also, it's a lot easier when you have 21 cylinders, you can actually move them in one piece, right? The big pieces that I showed you before, we were actually assembling them on site. But these cylinders could be assembled and moved whole. Again, taking these large problems, these large spaces, and starting to figure out ways to break it down into something that's more manageable, but also, because of now this much greater complexity of arrangement, much more interesting behavior. So, for example, this cylinder started out as a cylinder, and this one are the same. That is, they both started out the same diameter, right? But because of their position in relation to the architecture and each other, you get a very different kind of behavior. This one and this one are also the same, right? So I was continuing to sort of experiment at this very large scale. This is about 30 feet across, 12 or 14 feet tall. This is at the Albright Knox Gallery in Buffalo. And so I continued, again, trying to find ways to make the behavior more interesting, and what I'd like to say is sort of semi-predictable. I can sort of, certainly by this point, I can kind of tell you a sort of range of shapes you might get, but I could never tell you, even with the piece upstairs, exactly what shape those pieces are going to take under pressure. I mean, they won't turn into squares, right, or triangles, but they're going to change in ways that I can't precisely predict. But in that sort of range of behavior, I have a pretty good confidence of how they will behave in their structural properties. Next, please. So there's this idea, I don't know if any of you heard, there's close packing, right? That is, there are not so many ways actually physically for matter to go together, from the subatomic scale to the scale of galaxies. We see the same patterns, the same things repeating. And one of the things that was interesting for me with this work is that that even though I'm sort of creating the system, putting these together is not much different than building a wood pile or a dry stone wall or any other kind of thing where you have to deal with the geometry of the given material and a kind of purpose you want it to, or function you want it to perform. And the rules, if you want to call them that these systems follow, are essentially consistent, right? Even though they vary, you have to do certain things to make sure they won't fall over. In my case, I want to make triangles to provide stiffness. I want to have at least 3 points of contact, and so on. Next. And so I've kind of become a student of systems, and these are 3 random kind of masonry patterns, right, that start to give you some indication of how within a given geometry, maybe those round river stones are most similar to my work, but each geometry dictates, in a sense, tells you how to put the material together, right? That is, and you can't put it together, you can try to put it together some other ways, but you'll often end up with something that's very unstable or unworkable. Next. So the other consideration that came into being was that this is a project called Public Art Moving Site, organized by the Cambridge Arts Council, ArtSpace in New Haven, Connecticut, and an organization called RAMP in Bellows Falls, Vermont. And this is a different idea of public art. Has some similarities to what Jim mentioned before about being sort of invited to choose a site. But in this, I got to actually choose places to work, right? And so there became a possibility of taking an identical set of elements and then deploying them in different places and seeing what those different consequences might be. This is the piece in Cambridge right off Harvard Square. And you can see how it's very tightly compressed. So you get actually very consistent, more circular or elliptical kinds of shapes. Next, please. And this is the same set of pieces, same set of elements, up in an empty lot up in Bellows Falls, Vermont, where I was able to use a tree on this left side and sort of make this kind of cascade that tumbled across the lawn. And you can see already the different kind of behavior, the different character of this piece is. So, the way that this one squishes, because there's no longer any pressure from this side, so all that energy is sort of moving out through the long thing. This was also the first time that I used this kind of triangular, what I'm calling sort of a buttress kind of form. And I wanted to include that to sort of show some of the evolution. This is in 2006. Next, please. Finally, this is a piece I did in 2010 at Ohio University in Athens, not so far from here, actually, down the river. And you can see here that this buttress idea has become much more robust. This is 3.5 stories tall, about 45 feet tall. Comes out almost 33 feet into the lawn. This is an art museum that was an old asylum that was acquired by the university, so it's a spectacular vertical architecture. Wonderful museum there, the Kennedy Art Museum. It's a sprawling complex of 19th century buildings, most of which are no longer in use. They can't afford to renovate them or get rid of the asbestos and all a variety of its other problems. But here I really wanted to make a piece that responded to that verticality. And then this idea of the buttress, and that a buttress is a structure that's designed to hold something else up, right? But if we look at Gothic architecture, most famously, the buttresses become so large that in fact, without the building, the buttress would fall down. So they become this kind of, these dependent structures, right? This idea of that one thing that can't exist without the other. And clearly here, the way this, there's this old building certainly doesn't need my sculpture to stand, but there's a kind of visual indication that it might, but certainly my sculpture needs that building, right? It would fall otherwise. So there's this kind of, the way it sort of shoulders or leans against the architecture. Next. I also, before I stop, before I end the talk today, I wanted to say, some thanks. I thank my partners here, but this is Chase Jackson in the white hard hat. He's a student at Colgate. He's been working with me for a little over a year. He'll be a senior. He's been involved in the project, as you could see him in that wonderful video. Thank you, Shane, for that. Putting the cylinders together and spending 13 hours in a bucket in 105 degrees in the sun while we were installing that. That is Wacko back there, otherwise known as Steve, one of the great riggers on Jim Wilhide's crew. Next. And this is, I was trying to find a good picture of everybody looking up, but I couldn't. So Chase is over there in the gray. In the foreground here is Dwayne Martinez, an old friend, an artisan, model maker, works for our department. And in the back there is Peter Leone. He'll be a senior at Alfred State University, art major. So these pieces, even though they're all small elements, sort of in theory, I can build all of them alone. I mean, that's one of the nice things I like about making big things out of small parts. Similar to how an old cast iron building might have been built. That is, if you look at the structure of an old 19th century cast iron building, you'll see that even the big elements are made up of small ones, right? That everything was brought to site and kind of fabricated in place. So next image, please. Oh, so I almost forgot Packard. Packard Haynes. When the steel comes from the mill, probably more detail than you need to know, it's very greasy, right? And it needs to be cleaned so that it'll weather evenly. And Packard spent much of the summer washing and degreasing steel cylinders, so I owe him a big thanks as well. Next, please. And I just want to end with this image. This is a piece that we just finished a couple of weeks ago up at the DeCordova Museum and Sculpture Park in Lincoln, Massachusetts, about 20 miles outside of Boston. This is pretty much all of the cylinders I've ever made. It's from left to right, it's 150 feet long, about 14 feet tall in the center. Much of the material, much of the other installations I've showed you, these cylinders have been reused and repurposed here. It'll be up for a couple of years, but it's you know, it's been a very productive and great year, you know, with Concordia and now with Lincoln. And I do want to say, you know, finally, just to follow up it was really, this was a really exceptional public art project. That is, you know, just want to echo what Jim said in the video, that when usually there's some place you're supposed to put the work, right? The site, there's a little, you know, arrow or a red circle or a wall, very explicit, you know, this is what we need, this is what we need it for. Artists are almost never asked to identify sites. And it really was you know, when I proposed this, I thought, well, you know, it's the art center, LexArt's involved, the city, so, you know, it's a good site, you know, seems to have some potential, but, you know, I'm asking to put a big sculpture up on the roof. It was a real risk, and I want to, you know, applaud everyone involved for following through on that risk. You know, I'm really pleased with the results. It's my first permanent piece, as I said before, of this kind, and I look forward to a long life here and hearing how it becomes part of the community. Thank you.
Now, I would like to ask Lori Meadows, head of the Kentucky Arts Council, to say a few words, and then Mayor Gray.
Thanks, Jim. I just wanted to say that I think the inclusion of public art in a community really gives us a sense of the community's values. And this piece, Concordia, is a wonderful addition to Lexington's landscape. And, you know, I think there are several people that we need to recognize. Certainly Jim Clark for his commitment to public art. And, you know, I think it's doing wonderful things for Lexington, and Mayor Gray as well for his support of public art, especially on a city building. That's something that's very important. Public art is something that the Kentucky Arts Council supports very much in, I guess in theory, not so much in funding, but in theory. And we really, you know, appreciate additions like this. And, you know, certainly DeWitt, this is a wonderful piece to add not only to the city of Lexington, but to the state. And I think it also is a sign of how Kentucky, well, Lexington and Kentucky as well, but Lexington is moving forward and definitely supports the art. And so I would applaud everyone involved because of that. Thanks.
And now it's my pleasure to introduce Mayor Gray, who is probably one of the more supportive individuals helping artists. And I think it's because of their creativity and also the entrepreneurialism that they show, working at their craft and forging ahead and having a vision. And that's something that Mayor Gray relates to. So, Mayor Gray.
Lori, thanks for those remarks coming from the Capitol. We appreciate that. You know, as we're listening to DeWitt, I couldn't help but thinking that in my role as an elected official today, that, you know, you're reminding me and us of the risk associated with this project was just so reassuring. Just so reassuring. In fact, being in the construction business and the engineering business and looking at that and thinking about how much the weight and so forth, and thinking of, and thinking of the mechanical installation and those millwrights, those riggers, and I was thinking, I'm going to go talk to those guys and going to ask them now, guys, are you sure that it's all up there? Perfect. I know that you know it is. I was also thinking, though, that photograph of you, cities across America are really in need of new revenue streams. And that photograph of you, I was thinking, wedding pictures up there. There are lots of opportunities that we can make out of this.
I'm not in control of what happens after I install it.
But I think this really wonderful collection of people here is an illustration of the imagination that you describe, and in our city, and the appreciation for what a project like this really represents. I want to share with you, I've got a little piece of paper here because I printed it off. Last week, I happened to be able to take a few days off, and I went up north. And there's a little town of Rockport, Maine. And in that little town of Rockport, Maine, there's a contemporary art museum called the CMCA, or Contemporary Maine Coast Arts. And I was going through, they had a nice little collection of work by Maine artists. Now this is the land of, it's Louise Nevelson way back, and Marsden Hartley, is that right? Marsden Hartley, yeah. And today, Alex Katz and Yvonne Jacquette and Lois Dodd and Robert Indiana's over on one of the islands. And in this collection, there was a guy named Paul Oberst. Anybody here from the university? Anybody here from the law school? So you all remember that name? Okay, I looked at this sculpture of this guy. I was like, Oberst, there's not too many Obersts. So I asked the director, I said, so tell me a little bit about this work over here, this piece. And so she described it, and she said, I think he's from Kentucky. I said, I'm from Kentucky. I said, I knew that name that's an unusual name. So she described his work, and then she gave me his email and stuff. And before I got back to the house, I had an email. And so I'm going to read y'all this email. Dear Jim, hello, I am Paul Oberst, nephew of Paul Oberst of the UK Law School fame. And he goes on to say, Suzette McAvoy, the director of CMCA in Rockport, told me you stopped by and mentioned my work in the benefit show. I'm a Centre College graduate, have worked in some major collections around the country, including museums, blah, 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 blah. And he talks about in work in Philadelphia and so forth. This past March, we visited the 21C in Louisville. And we're really like that. Saw what was going on. But Jim, I like what is happening in Lexington. The new DeWitt Godfrey piece up on top of the Downtown Arts Center is incredible. Works like that show great vision on the part of your community and its people. I am most impressed. And you know what? I didn't think I could say anything tonight which would do the project any more justice than that. To have someone way up in a little town. Now, where is Paul? Paul lives in Freedom, Maine. And that's a town of about 25 people. And he is real aware of what this project has done for our city. So, DeWitt, we all thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim.
For bringing your imagination and your inspiration to our city.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I was getting a little nervous there with that story of where it was going. What DeWitt did not mention is on the day that this was installed, when it was 105 degrees, it was also the Gay Pride Festival was going on, and we had blocked 2 lanes of traffic on Main Street. So it was quite a day, especially when the March Madness marching band came down Main Street and stopped for a while in front of the Downtown Arts Center. And of course, we told DeWitt that we had ordered that for him. That this is what we always do. And if you could imagine all those construction workers and the comments they might have made with Gay Pride going on and everything, and it was, I felt very Italian. But we're very grateful for DeWitt to make this happen. And our dedication ceremony is rather glamorous, because what I will do is show you the prototype for the sign that will be outside on Main Street. It is now a prototype because we want to make sure that everybody's name is spelled correctly and before we go into bronze. So this will be the sign that will be out front. And we also have an exhibit of the making of Concordia up on the 2nd floor in the City Gallery. So thank you all for coming. We appreciate your support. And also, if you would like to see more public art, please let us know, and please fund it. Thank you all for coming.